With all of these advertisements and images of periods and tampons and etc., we have the birth control movement kind of burst upon the scene and becomes very important after World War II. And there was a social reform that started in 1914 to increase legalization and availability of birth control, led by Emma Goldman, Mary Dennett, and Margaret Sanger. And in the 20s and 30s, anti-contraception laws began to weaken, and the Planned Parenthood Federation of America was formed in 1942. And after World War II, birth control was fully embraced by the medical profession. So we have that with the figure of Margaret Sanger being one of sort of the main figures that people discuss. She really takes the stage quite often in different conferences like the March of 1925, the International Birth Control Conference, to argue for the health and happiness of the unborn child and abortion as an alternative to enforced enslaved maternity, which sounds quite drastic, but purposeful. So she is quoted in Betty Friedan's book, where she says she has no identity except as a wife and a mother. I don't know where there's because it's 18. She does not know who she is herself. She waits all day for her husband to come home at night to make her feel alive, and it is now that the husband who is not interested. It is terrible for the women to lie there night after night waiting for her husband to make her feel alive. I put these dashes in here. I was literally just talking to myself about it, as a separation between 18 and 19 pages in The Feminine Mystique. You have her engaging with protests, like in 1925, or 1929, I'm sorry, where she covers her mouth in protest of being denied the right to talk about birth control. And this little ad here, and the villain still pursues her. As well as this Time magazine cover. Now, birth control is approved officially in the 1960s. Enovid is the first one here. And then in 1966, we'll see the sort of traditional dispenser sort of come to play as women need to keep track of what days they're taking the pill. But we do have sort of this very interesting scene, sort of birth forth of people kind of embracing birth control and women's health, fertility health in general. So much so that we have, in the 1970s, we have The Pill, which is a song recorded by Loretta Lynn. These are some of the lyrics. I will post the song of hers from YouTube on the Moodle because it's super weird. So what did birth control mean for BIPOC women who were sort of not white and privileged at this time? What did that sort of mean with the development of birth control at large? So there are some obvious issues with Margaret Sanger with her association with the eugenics movement, which will come to be a big part of her reputation. She argued that birth control could be used to weed out defective babies. It was part of an ongoing alignment with those who thought birth control could be used to breed more desirable traits into the population, a move possibly informed by her desperation to popularize conception, as well as her conversations with the Ku Klux Klan. So it seems that Planned Parenthood, while removing her name from some of their sort of institutional locations and information, that they still have said that a lot of her ideas and quotes were taken out of context. And they have created a sheet sort of talking about all of these issues surrounding sort of Margaret Sanger and why a lot of these texts and ideas have been sort of taken out of context, though there probably is a possibility surrounding the fact that she was racist and maybe encouraged sterilization. But it's not 100% clear from both sides, sort of in trying to fact check one another. I feel like when most people use Margaret Sanger to talk about negatively in conversation about like sterilization or birth control or abortions, it's mostly by like um, people who are anti-abortion. So I'm not entirely sure, and it's not something that I've researched extensively for this class. But just be aware that that is part of sort of the history of who she is as a figure, and it definitely leads to some of the problems with Black women, Native American women, Puerto Rican women being concerned about how birth control is going to be used, and those fears are completely valid. As you start to look at the brochures that were put out by North Carolina and other states as well, there was this large idea about bettering the human population through sterilization of people who were poor or mentally ill. And so you would see these pamphlets that were just ridiculously sort of ableist and racist that encouraged eugenics, which is almost crazy as you have the United States fighting eugenics overseas, but not sort of fighting eugenics in their own nation. And very much kind of clues into some of the larger issues about the 1950s as well. And so you see this overwhelming fear coming from all BIPOC populations because of the history of sterilizing women who are not white. So there was forced sterilization that was legal in 32 states until the late 1970s. Such as forcing experimental treatment on women like Anarcha Westcott, who was treated and mistreated by a number of figures, specifically J. Marion Sims. And I have this video here that I will put on the Moodle as well. But using her for experimental treatments, and again, going back to John Oliver in his conversations about medical bias, you have sort of the other side, which is race, where there's this belief that Black women don't feel pain. And a lot of that goes back to some of these concepts of slavery as well. And so we have a lot of these methods and ideas being not only tested on Black women during the 50s, but even sort of these ridiculously awful concepts and ideas where these women come out, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who says that she was sterilized against her will. And it became known in like the 40s and the 50s amongst popular culture as part of the civil rights movement, which we'll come back to, that people are sterilizing, that doctors are sterilizing Black women against their will and without their permission. And to the extent that Fannie Lou Hamer comes up with the term or concept Mississippi appendectomy, where people were being sterilized against their will. And so it became the most rapidly growing form of birth control in the U.S., rising from 200,000 cases in 1970 to over 700,000 in 1980. Common belief in the South that Black women were routinely sterilized without their informed consent or for no valid medical reason. Changing hospitals performed unnecessary hysterectomies on poor Black women as a practice for their medical residents. So we have this insane type of eugenics occurring and sterilization in the South without people sort of talking about it for a long time. I mean, the 80s, can you imagine? So you have all of these women who have come to speak out about these issues, that it was still legal to sterilize women if they thought they were feeble-minded. And so women like Elaine Riddick, who was sterilized at 14 years old, because she was raped and assaulted, and they said that she was feeble-minded because she was promiscuous. And she's worked to try to get compensation for these things, but it comes down to, she asks, so what am I worth? The kids that I do not have, could not have, what are they worth? And her one son that she had before she was sterilized says priceless. So this type of sterilization and eugenics continued far into the 20th century, and the way that people were treating Black women. And to the extent that on June 14th of 1973, you have this case come out where two young girls are sterilized, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph, age 14 and 12, at a Montgomery family planning clinic. So these girls, against their will, were sterilized, and they sort of sparked a lawsuit against this clinic, and helped to start the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse. This clinic had convinced their parents that they were receiving some sort of birth control, which they did receive to some extent, but when it came up that they would be sterilized, they tricked the mother into signing this as she was illiterate, and so she just signed with an X, not realizing what she was signing for. So this sort of misuse and mistreatment of poor Black women who could not read at the time in the 70s. And they were in public housing, and so they were easy targets to this clinic to sort of find and mistreat. And they would even come to their home, and they tried to sterilize their older sister Katie, but she hid from them in their home. And so these young girls became a catalyst for people really starting to talk about this issue, along with Fannie Lou Hamer. But still, this was a continuing issue for quite some time, with Black women being sterilized against their will. And it appears that these young girls were mentally disabled, or that one of them was. I haven't seemed to get like a clear idea that Mary Alice was likely mentally disabled, but possibly not Minnie Lee. It seems to be that either it's both or just one of them. But again, sort of deciding in this sort of ableist context what is right or wrong for someone at the age of 12 or 14 is absolutely appalling. And what we see, that this is not just an issue for Black women, also is a massive issue for Native American women as well, as they are sterilized, and their birth rate drastically drops from 3.7 children in 1970 to 1.8 in 1980. And telling Native American women and Black women that this tubal litigation that they were receiving was actually getting your tubes tied, which is a phrase we use today, but was used in clinics to make women think that these were reversible, so that they could use this as sort of temporary birth control when it is not something that can be reversed. And so when it comes out in 1976 that the U.S. General Accountability Office found between 73 and 76 that 4 of these Indian Health Service locations, or IHS, were misunderstanding regulations, and sterilized 3,406 women, including 36 cases where women were under 21 years old. And so what they found was that this was only 4 places, and that it was around 70,000 women were sterilized in 12 locations total. And they would use such dialogues as women being sterilized, Native American women, that it would improve their lives for the future financially. You have images like this would be used. If you have less children, you will be more wealthy. And so You also have Jane Lawrence writing in the American Indian Quarterly that Native American women were not intelligent enough to use other birth control methods and thus had to be sterilized. And so, as you can imagine, Native American women make their own group in 1974 called WARN, which stands for Women of All Red Nations, in which they work to fight against some of these issues surrounding sterilization of Native American women, which is absolutely horrific. And you have some famous figures such as Lorelei Decorah Means, who's not here pictured, Madonna Thunderhawk, Phyllis Young, and Janet McLeod, as well as 300 other women from 30 different tribal communities. So, and they also fought cases where pollution and uranium mining was causing birth defects for Native American children. So they became a large group in trying to protect Indigenous women from these sort of things that were happening in the United States to them at the time. And again, this is very shortly after they're finally allowed to be citizens in their own country, right? This is also happening to Puerto Rican women. They found that half of Puerto Rican mothers ages 20 to 49 were sterilized in a law of law 116, which was part of population control in Puerto Rico. So we have a committee to end sterilization abuse in the 1970s, and they trying to end sterilization issues in hospitals and other institutions. But this went on for a long time and had sort of egregious effects to the Native American populations, Puerto Rican, Black women, that they were forced into not having more children. And this sort of movement to kind of end the population growth of these women while promoting the growth of white women, which is just something you can't imagine, but also at the same time feels so timely in that now we're sterilizing Mexican women in camps. So I don't know. Seeing history repeat itself or continue to do the same thing in the 21st century is beyond my understanding. So when President Lyndon Johnson establishes federal funding for birth control for the poor and starts promoting clinics in the 1960s, 1970s, there's obviously that Black women are suspicious and fear that government-funded birth control clinics are trying to limit the Black population and stunt Black political power. And again, all of this comes down to constructs that were created under slavery, that women went into hospitals to have their children and came out sterilized, and these hysterectomies, as I said before. And so Black women are scared. They are legitimately scared of taking the pill, of thinking that they could, on one hand, take control of their own sexual liberation, and on the other hand, be walking into something where they are being forced sterilized again. And so you have Toni Cade Bambara, who writes The Pill, Genocide or Liberation in 1969, and asking these sort of questions about conception, contraception, and how that affects the Black woman, because you have all these fronts where you're having Black men tell them they can't take birth control, and you have a fear from the white population and the government at large, so then who do you trust? Black men would stand up stating, told the sisters to throw away the pill and hop onto the mattresses and breed revolutionaries and mess up the man's genocidal program. And so you had all these reasons for women to be scared. And and I also have Dick Gregory, who was a comedian, who said that as well, to bigger families as effective Black protest. But again, is that an answer to the larger issues that are occurring? And you even see in Ebony magazine, how safe are birth control pills? Should we trust them? in 68. And where is this one from? I don't have the date on Lena Horne's. But what we do have happening is that after a clinic is shut down in Pittsburgh by Black men concerned about sterilization, do I have this? Nope, it's not in here. Because of this fear that there is a pill for women, white women, and a pill for Black women, and this fear of why can't we get basic health care like a free aspirin for a headache, but when you are a Black woman old enough to look sexy, you can get a truckload of birth control pills for free. These women decide that they are going to protest for access to birth control. So it's very powerful that even that there's so much fear out there that Black women still try to work hard with this Pittsburgh clinic to try to get free birth control and to sort of control their own sexual identity in a lot of ways. It's a powerful statement about who they are and what they wanted, because they had legitimate reasons to be afraid.